We're fortunate today to be sitting here with Robert Benjamin. He's one of the leaders in the conflict resolution field. He has been mediating since the late 70s, the past president of the Academy of Family Mediators, now a member of ACR, the Association for Conflict Resolution, the recipient of the John Haynes Award in 2009. He's authored over 100 articles available on mediate.com and a variety of other places. He is also the senior editor of the Eye of the Storm series. This was an interview of 64 of the world's best-known mediators. It's available on mediate.com.
A torturous route, as you might be not surprised to hear. You know, I had always been involved with working with kids and families, worked in juvenile courts and psychiatric facilities and such as that early on, and saw how people were treated in that circumstance. The one kid that, excuse me, was going to throw a chair through the nurse's window. He was very upset. The psychiatrist couldn't get off the floor fast enough, you know. And then later moved on to the juvenile court, and you know, and thought about, do I want to do this counseling stuff, and decided I wasn't sure about that. And after working in the juvenile court, showing how the legal system dealt with families and children, decided to go to law school. And at every step of the way, where the story is going, is that it became intriguing to me how in law school, you know, they really had very little notion about what was going on with families and children. And then I decided, well, I'm going to go to social work school at the same time, you know, and see what they say. And of course, they would have nothing to do with the legal issues. So what I found was that these two professions that were intimately relevant and inextricably connected with each other. Mm-hmm. It was kind of like one was, and I won't choose which, was standing at the rear end of an elephant about a foot away, and the other was at the front end of the elephant about a foot away, each describing the beast, families, children, whatever, and had absolutely no idea about what it really looked like. Legal people only concerned about the law. Counseling people, social work people, only concerned about the interpersonal dynamics. So when I got out, knowing very little, needed to practice law and started to do that, it became very apparent as I would do divorces or even business matters that people were similarly lost in the middle, fell through the crack. They would go to the lawyer who would tell them one thing, they'd go to a counselor who might tell them another, and started to try and look at how you could pull those things together, and started to actually say, well, you know, could these people actually just talk to each other back in the mid-70s, you know, and then found that there were other people who were doing much of the same thing, this mediation thing, and was very excited, mostly because here was something that a field where they actually tried to apply systemic thinking. That you can't manage an issue, controversy, without understanding that there are the legal, that there's the personal, emotional, psychosocial, and of course the business and financial as well. So became very involved in it from that perspective. And then, as we'll discover later perhaps in the interview, have an opportunity to talk about, been frustrated though since, because see that this field that drew me in because of a systems perspective has actually moved since that time, since the late 70s, into being just another fragmented, piecemealed system where you have certain people doing certain kinds of cases and only a part of it, and other people doing other parts of cases, and actually rules that say these people who aren't lawyers can't handle money, these people who are lawyers shouldn't be involved in the counseling parts of it, as if all of these are to be owned by the discipline. And that's how I got there. That's how I got into the field, and that's how I got to be so ornery about how I see the field moving.
I keep hearing you talk about guerrilla negotiations. It's hard for me to reconcile the image of a negotiator with somebody running through the rainforest, a guerrilla armsman. Can you help explain to me what that means?
The briefest way is to go back into history, which is apparently the first thing that has been forgotten. I think many people like to believe this field was invented with the writing of Getting to Yes in 1981, and that everybody would sit down in our modern view of being very reasonable people. We would sit down and people were capable of doing that, that they would be able to calculate their own interest needs and make choices accordingly if given the opportunity. I've never seen that. I mean, or seldom see it. Sometimes people come to it. Sometimes the reasonable part sneaks through, but seldom do people start that way. And if you go back and you look at negotiation, before we started to impose our models about how people should be, negotiation actually grew up, developed out of, side by side with, symbiotically with warfare. If you have a war, you got to bring it to an end. You got to negotiate. And that's the way it's been done since Sun Tzu in the 5th century BC. Thucydides talks about negotiation, should we do it, in the Peloponnesian Wars. It's always been in that context. So negotiation has developed out of warfare. In many ways, just as medical care, medical treatment has been significantly advanced because of what you have to do on the battlefield to save people's lives. Negotiation in its primal level has been about people surviving. And it still is. So I don't care what kind of model you use of expecting people to be reasonable when they sit down in a divorce case, or you're dealing with a Donald Trump in a business deal. One or both of those people feels that their survival is on the line. They certainly at least have flashes of that. Recognizing that means that you have to recognize that there's a whole lot of negotiation in warfare and a whole lot of warfare strategy in negotiation. So to answer your question very directly is to say that if you look at what you're doing in warfare and what you're doing in negotiation, they have more in common. They're more similar than dissimilar. Both require the battlefield general has to assess the conflict terrain, the battlefield, engagement. Where do I want to enter? How do I want to deploy my troops? What do I want to do to bring this thing to some level of successful conclusion? Mediator does the same thing. I look at the conflict terrain. Where are my alliances? Where are the resistances? How will I neutralize resistances? The tactics are very much the same. What you communicate, how you say things, and your speed and finesse, sometimes being shocking, surprising. So that very often, for instance, to give you a very specific example, I've had people say, well, you know, the notion of being a mediator means you're supposed to be very nice, you know, and always pleasant and patient, long-suffering. You know, and I thought about that. People have come to me for training and they say, well, I've been to a career council. They said, you know, I'm really well suited. I took the Myers-Briggs, another story, but this is what I'm supposed to be as a mediator. I'm good with people and communication. It's not unimportant. The communication is essential. But you also have to be very mindful that people don't want to be there, for the most part, and you will have to use some of the same kinds of strategies, some levels of deception, constructively, but deception nonetheless, to draw people in. So just as a guerrilla fighter must use the terrain, I don't have big weapons I can call in. I've got to work the land, work the terrain I'm dealing with, work with the people and what they give me. Just like a guerrilla fighter has to be able to feel out what's going on around him and use those resources, turning weaknesses into strengths and being mindful of what's coming at him from the sides. So that's what I want. I want people to be a bit more realistic. So not guerrilla in the terms of trying to beat somebody. That's the only difference between warfare and negotiation. Purpose of warfare is to win, coerce, force. Purpose of negotiation, ideally, is to come to agreement. But setting aside the end consequence, the strategies and the tactics are very similar. I take that even a little further, if I might, just quickly, I've written about this, I just find it so intriguing. You know, you have General Petraeus, The Nature of Warfare Today. General Petraeus wrote the U.S. Army Marine Corps Counterinsurgency Field Manual. If you look at page 42, 43 of his field manual, now this is the Marine Corps Army General Petraeus, wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, came out of experiences in Vietnam. More and more, with the new form of warfare, military people are learning mediation and negotiation skills because you don't know who the enemy is. Nobody wears the right uniforms anymore, so you know who to shoot at. So you have to win the hearts and minds of the civilian population as much as you have to be able to isolate the actual enemy. Great line from there that is directly relevant to us as mediators and negotiators. You know, the best weapons don't shoot. So here's a place where our skills in negotiation and mediation are being directly applied to our military strategy.
So now let's flip to the other side. You've been talking about guerrilla negotiation, but in your writing you've also mentioned the beauty of conflict, the art of conflict. Can you explain what you mean by that?
You know, the piece that I'm trying to ferret out in the field is that everybody who comes to mediation wants to be a mediator, has their own purposes. Some from a strong sense of ideology, others a spiritual commitment. They want to and feel that conflict is transformative. It's an opportunity for us to shift and for society to effectively be changed. They see themselves, and you very commonly hear the term for mediators, negotiators, that they are peacemakers. I take a bit different view. You know, I think that negotiation and mediation at core is as much about peace and justice as a court of law is about bringing about fair and just results. Sometimes they pass each other and actually touch momentarily. But ultimately, the legal system functions and it is or is not fair. That's an after-the-fact determination. The same is true with negotiation mediation. At core, it's a very pragmatic skill set that helps people survive and doesn't purport or pretend to fix the problem. So at some point, the piece of it in the beauty of conflict is having people who are in this field appreciate the fullest dimension of what they're working with when they're working with conflict. That conflict at once is horrid, obnoxious. I mean, you know, picture that. Picture negotiating, mediating a child sexual abuse case, or the damages at Sandy Hook. You know, the lawsuits that will come out of it, or the 9/11 process for compensating people. You know, conflict is on one level ugly and horrible, as is war. At the same time, to be able to come to some measure of, I hate the word closure, but some measure of terms to be able to move on, has a strange and tortured beauty. So when I talk about the beauty of conflict, and I've been always fascinated in art, enjoy it, you know, going all the way back, how many times artists deal with the theme of conflict. And again, they deal with the same issues we do. Their bias, their perspective. You know, so if you look at how Caravaggio painted the head of Holofernes, it's a very technical picture. He's a man. You know, Holofernes being the guy that raped and killed people. When Artemisia Gentileschi, one of the very first women artists, painted the same scene, she was over him and the knife was right at his throat. And you could see that this was personal, she having worked in her father's studio and been raped by one of the people who worked in the studio. So you can see in the painting, in art history, here is a scene of a horrid event that is a piece of beauty. On some level, you can come around the corner and you can look at the colors and you can look at the figures and the technical expertise and you can be absolutely awed. And then you start to recognize what this is about. Not only on the surface, but what's in it. Another artist, Leon Golub, who just recently died. And his colors are so incredibly vivid. It's a beautiful piece of modern art. The reds and the greens and the colors of it just jump at you. Very, very strong. And then you start to see what he's painting. It's a scene of an interrogation in South Africa of a black man by two whites, you know, pre-end of apartheid, that is ugly, horrid. And so here's this piece of beauty and you're struck and you're almost feeling a bit guilty of, you know, I'm enjoying the beauty of this scene. I think mediators need to come to a place of getting that kind of, having that kind of vision of what they're doing. Art gives you an opportunity to see things through a different lens. But that's what I mean when I talk about the beauty of conflict.
Do you think that mediators and negotiators are confusing the idea of peacekeeping with happiness? Not just that we have arrived at peace after having been through the storm, but that we just want things to be happy all the time and comfortable and peaceful.
I'm afraid of that. You know, I'm afraid of that. You know, I'll very often do that, and I know I've garnered a bit of a reputation for being insistent of pressing people to actually explore, first and foremost, before you start doing it with other people, that you explore your own reactions and responses to conflict. And my general observation is, you know, that many people who are drawn to this field are conflict avoidant. Now, lawyers are too, but perhaps even more so. And that affection bias, you know, Jerome Groopman, who writes about medical practice, has written a great piece about how doctors are really at risk if they care too much about their patients, because too often they don't want to ask the hard questions, and they're willing to let things slide. You know, so there's a risk of having an affection bias, of not asking hard questions, because I don't want to stir things, and they seem to be good, and the relationship is more important. Well, that's fine, but you may be doing these people a disservice. My job is not to make people friends. They'll do that for themselves. In fact, they may do it better if they've been given the real opportunity to deal realistically with hard issues. So very often it's my job to raise problems. And I don't even know that peace comes into it. You know, peace is not my concern. My concern is them having every opportunity to have considered, you know, what it is they're doing. So that too often what we teach, for instance, I'll give you a specific example. You have seminars on forgiveness. It's very nice to have some seminars on forgiveness. And forgiveness is very important, and it even has a neurological piece where the brain relaxes when you forgive. No question about it. The problem is that very often forgiveness does not come about except by understanding the desire and the need for revenge. And revenge also plays a very important part in our evolutionary psychology and biology. Many people will remark about how good it feels to take revenge. He hurt me. I want to hurt him back in some way. Now, it doesn't mean that you encourage people to act out, but it's important for mediators to have in their seminars not just the forgiveness, the feel-good part, but to have an appreciation of the harsh piece of the desire for revenge that most people feel. So I'm just trying to pull things together and see it in its fullest organistic dimension, as opposed to just trying to pretend, well, if we are just nice. It's like we can teach people not to use guns by not letting them ever have guns. You know, and studies have not supported that people become necessarily less violent.
So now, Robert, if we could move to you personally, can you tell us a little bit about your experience to date, some of the pluses and minuses, perhaps some advice that you would give to people new in the field, and what advice can you give based off of mistakes that you've made and successes you've had?
You know, if I had to identify, you know, I don't know that I made plenty of mistakes. I mean, God, I could list those. You know, that'd be quite a list. But curiously, you know, I think that what it's about is, as it is for most people, is what they teach, what they practice as a profession, what they do in life. You know, is basically what they most need to learn on some level. And so, you know, I grew up in a fair amount of my own conflict. We don't have to go into details, but spent a lot of time beating my head against the wall. And at some point, came to terms with the fact that, you know, maybe there's another way. I knew it wasn't the way they were telling me to do it. I mean, you know, God knows I could not ever, agree with authority, you know, and so I couldn't do it their way. But how would I want it done? So, you know, a lot of what I learn, so that even when I see what I've been others are being told to do in terms of negotiation, mediation, think about it, and I think to myself, if I were in there and somebody were to, for instance, let me give you an example, give me ground rules. In fact, to share something personal with you, just to give you an idea of this and make it very real, you know, I remember going to marriage counseling, you know, and guess I should say right away, it's the absolute truth, tremendous amount of respect and regard for my former wife, feelings of affection, but at that particular time, things were strained, obviously. And sitting down with the counselor, who began with, you know, I want you to know I have certain ground rules about how we'll do business in here. You know, and that I really will ask that neither of you, you know, attack the other person, you know, and that there will be no physical violence or aggression. You know, and I'm listening to this, and she's kind of going on, and, you know, that you'll try and listen to each other, and this and that, and that you will not use inappropriate language, you know. And I guess about 3-4 minutes into it, you know, I was at a place where I just basically stood up and I said, thank you very much. You know, she looked at me, you know, my now former wife looked at me. What do you mean, thank you very much? Where are you going? I said, I'm done. You know, how much do I owe you? She said, well, where are you going? I said, well, you know, I'm not going to do this process with you. I don't understand. Why not? So we've already made all kinds of assumptions, I assume, you know, about this is going to be physically violent or aggressive, that I'll do something, that I will use language. And I'm angry. So if you're giving me all these ground rules, you know, ain't going to work for me. There's no sense in going any further. You know, your presumption about what this situation is without even knowing us, me, you know, I'm just not comfortable. You know, now, of course, as has happened many times in my life, that was the final nail in the coffin of my marriage. But at the same time, I guess I am that prickly, hypersensitive client that wants to be engaged where I am, not where that person wants to put me. So I've never found much use for giving a list of ground rules. I don't think it helps people. In fact, my worst fear would be, is from some of the things that we've talked about, that they'll follow my silly ground rules. That if I hit a nerve, they won't pop up and say, that's just crazy, or in much harsher language than that. You know, but the point being, the ground rules is very often the mediator's need to control, less so than an effective technique for engaging the conflict. You know, it's kind of like, you know, if you go into an orthopod, you have a very, very painful knee. He gives you all kinds of medication. You know, you don't feel it. You got all that Vicodin running through you. And then he says, and then he's moving your knee around. He says, where does it hurt? I said, I don't know. It's fine now. I mean, you know, I can't feel a damn thing. I want people to express that anger, that frustration. It lets me know where their nerves are. It lets me know what I need to work with. But as to, so what I tell them is that, you know, it's my biggest bugaboo with the field, and what I would tell them is to not necessarily listen to so much of what they're being told about the how-to, and to think more about who are they and what are they trying to do. You know, a lot of our education is focused on how do we intervene, how do we make those people, fix them, intervene on them, assess them, as opposed to where it really starts, which is us. How do we feel about conflict? Where do we learn? Are you conflict avoidant, or you like conflict too much? Will you miss what's going on because you're desensitized to it? You know, what about negotiation? Where'd you learn to do it? Women and men negotiate differently. People from different religious backgrounds negotiate differently. Different cultures. Everything is coming to play. At that point of conflict, it's the most fascinating thing in the world. Intellectually, the depth of it, the breadth of it, as well as the practical, making it work, takes into account history, theology, neuroscience, psychology, social psychology, communications, art. Everything that you've experienced in your life is brought to bear. And too often, I think that the teaching is too narrow. And that concerns me. And I think that it's a mistake. The biggest mistake is made is to focus too much on the how-to. The how-to will come to you relatively soon if you're fairly clear about what it is you're trying to do when you're working with other human beings or you're trying to negotiate something. What are you trying to do? How are you trying to get there? You know, and start from that point about what they need and you need, as opposed to a model that you're going to impose on them with a clear intention of an outcome of they will be settled, they will be empowered, they will be... That's for them to do. Your job is to focus on how do we manage this issue. My biggest problem is constantly, as for any professional, is that you get a little bit to a point where I think I've seen it. And as soon as I think I've seen it before and I know how to deal with it, I miss it. So how do you keep yourself fresh? How do you engage each of these people and not let it be rote? You know, there's a certain amount of that, and that's the way it should be, because it gives me time to kind of ruminate about what else I might do. But much of the framing of what you're supposed to be, your role of a mediator, certainly being a neutral, is unhelpful. Being always patient. You know, I've talked with mediators before about, you know, the idea that sometimes delivering a shock. You know, I got to tell you something. I'm really frustrated with this. It seems like we're going round and round in circles, folks. I say, you know, I think we can get out of it, but I guess I'm just wondering where you are. You know, shake them up. Give them an opportunity to recommit. You know, don't be so nice. Ask hard questions. You know, I'm curious. If I was sitting in this chair, I guess I'd wonder. You know, you've come up with a very nice agreement where you're going to continue to share holidays together. All right, and I appreciate, Jimmy, that you're an orphan. You don't have a family. That's what you feel you're losing the most in this marriage. Piece from a real case is being able to be with her family on Christmas Day. Okay, you know, and she jumps up and says, "Oh, well, you can continue to do that." And I said, "Well, it's very nice. You can be friends. You can, all of that kind of stuff. I mean, the true California experience. You know, we'd have a little party for the divorce. And if they want to do that, that's fine. I'm not trying to cast aspersions. But the point is, somebody's got to ask the hard question of, yeah, but what about if next year she's dating somebody else?" I wouldn't necessarily say it out loud like that, but that's what's going to come to mind. So if I just let them go and feel good, I haven't done my job. My job is to be comfortable enough with conflict to ask the hard questions and sometimes stir it up. They don't want to deal with it, that's their choice. But I'm very concerned that where the object of the mediation becomes peacemaking, being nice, we lose a lot of that. Now, on the other hand, I mean, I'm appreciative of the fact that I have to be very careful. I don't mediate necessarily at all the way I am otherwise, where they are doing me the honor of inviting me into their most intimate space. I ain't doing them a favor, as much as we'd like to think that as a professional role would take. So I'm very, very leery about setting lots of rules for people about how they must be and their preconditions. You must be reasonable, trusting, and respectful. You know, this purpose of this is to have you be friends. Here's how you will behave in mediation. And after having said all of that, then we say to them, now you can make your own decisions, as long as you do it our way, and come up with a solution that we agree with, that we agree is in the best interest of the child, is a fair one, and it's been a level playing field. Well, come on, folks, have you ever seen a level playing field in your life? Ever? It's not a question of is it a level playing field, it's a question of how uneven is it? And what can you do to make it workable enough? So I guess that's my quick overview of what's drawn me in is the intellectual fascination with how do you actually help people allow people more accurately to make good decisions for themselves, given the reality that none of us are the rational actors we pretend to be, or like to. We all think everybody else should be just like us, as rational as us. Well, in fact, I think as Kahneman and a number of psychologists have noted, most of us, most of the time, have a good measure of being predictably irrational. We have some biases in there. So it makes that whole concept of being a neutral, objective, above the fray, that drawn out of science, the scientific method of you are a expert professional, makes it all the more silly, but prevalent nonetheless.
Thank you very much.